Hello everybody, welcome to Anthropology 101. Over these last few weeks, we've been talking a lot about how do we understand people's cultural worlds as they emerge within these broader, globalizing systems of interrelationship, of world interdependence, right? And how can we think about these, particularly in relationship to things like colonialism, capitalism and economy, and class? And so the big takeaway from last class was a critique of this model of culture being like billiard balls and saying culture really isn't like billiard balls. It's not bounded and discrete things that just bounce off one another. And instead of thinking about these kinds of cultural and static and bounded cultures in the billiard ball model, we can focus on other kinds of dynamics. We can focus on the ways in which representations, which include images and informations, as well as goods and capital, and even people move across the globe. We can look at flows of people, images, goods. We can look at power relationships and social inequalities, both in a global sense, global inequalities, as well as local inequalities. And we can look at history and adaptation. Instead of saying these are timeless cultural traditions, we can instead say, how do these cultural practices and beliefs make sense within this person's historical context, within their larger political economic context? And how does it help them adapt to this reality? And so these are the themes that we're really picking up on with this next set of readings. And we're going to be talking a lot about how do we understand these global interconnections. And so one of the kinds of concepts that I wanted to throw out and give to y'all is world systems theory. And I think that this is a framework that y'all will find very useful in grappling with many of the issues and problems and contradictions that we've been engaging with through course discussions. There's a second concept that we'll get to later in the class, which is racial capitalism, because I do think, based on how this class is going, that I think y'all would be interested in thinking about these questions of how do we understand global capitalism and global economic processes and the relationship between these and colonialism and white supremacy. But focusing for now on world systems theory. This is a concept that comes from a philosopher, Emanuel Wallerstein. And basically it's a way of talking about global inequalities and global extractive processes. The idea, right, is we can think of the world as consisting of cores, peripheries, and semi-peripheries. Cores are basically metropolitan centers, places like New York, London, Paris. Peripheries are places that are historically colonized and exploited. Places like Nigeria, I would say Papua New Guinea is an excellent example. But even, for example, we could talk about the periphery in terms of the barrio in New York compared to Wall Street in New York. Now, semi-periphery can mean a few different things. In the map that you have here, it kind of looks like semi-periphery is like nations that are not quite so underdeveloped or undeveloped through these global extractive processes. I would actually say semi-peripheries would be more like thinking about local cities that serve as a midpoint for flows of capital. So places like Nairobi, where there is kinds of a larger local wealthy elite that is still engaged in these kinds of broader economic systems, but from a very different place. So the way in which this language really helps us think about global inequalities is because essentially what we're talking about is the way in which cheap labor and raw materials are extracted from the periphery and moved to the core. And then from the core, these materials are then produced into high expense commodity goods, which then can be sold from which are then sold back to the whole world, right, at massive profit. So an example of this would be your iPhone, right? You have lithium, which is mined from places like now Bolivia as a result of many of the political shifts that are happening there right now. But you have these mines where raw resources like lithium are extracted. It's moved across the globe where it's assembled into the actual iPhone in factories in places like China. These tend to be places with very limited worker labor rights legislation, where it's very cheap for companies to have massive factories because they don't have to spend money doing things like offering humane working conditions. But then the companies themselves, right, are going to be based in places like Silicon Valley or wherever Apple is based in. I'm not sure, right? But the idea is that the company itself is based in, for Apple, the United States, right? So there's this process where raw goods are moved from the periphery and assembled into commodities in a way that produces profits in the core, in places like New York, Silicon Valley, London. And then, meanwhile, that kind of that extraction of resources really reproduces or creates the poverty of poverty within the periphery, right? So it's a logic of extraction and exploitation that generates very uneven wealth and uneven profits. Now, one of the students, Lee, in this class really articulated this concept really nicely in a previous discussion. And so this is a quote from her. She was talking about Papua New Guinea, but we can talk about, this is actually a good way of talking about any peripheral context. Any context in the sense of the periphery of the world system. This is not an underdeveloped country, it's an overexploited country, right? So when we talk about world systems, we're talking about economic systems that generate lots of profit and wealth and capital in certain geographical spaces and poverty in others. And this is again about the movement of things like labor and raw materials and capital and profit across this global world system. So we have several examples of how this process works, right? To kind of nail it down. Today we have Miriam Kam talking about Tahiti, and we have an article about the crack economy in El Barrio in New York. But of course, this model speaks also very well to the book we've been reading about Papua New Guinea. So Miriam's article is more complicated in some ways, so I'm just going to go over it pretty briefly. My aim is not to cover the entire argument in all of its detail, but rather to reconstruct a kind of bare bones outline of what she's doing. So on a theoretical level, right, what Miriam is saying, what Miriam Khan is arguing, right, is that there's actually, we can think about Tahiti as being multiple spaces, right? Not just a single place, but many. A place that's constructed in tourist imaginaries as a kind of vacation spot, as a paradise on earth, as a place that is a nuclear testing facility, or near nuclear testing facilities within the Pacific Ocean or broader French Polynesia. And also as indigenous space, as land that nurtures people and provides sustenance. But she says, right, like we can think about this as really being multiple Tahitis on the one hand, but on the other hand, because these representations are not free-floating, because these globalized images are not free-floating, they're actually anchored in place, and that means that sometimes the contradictions between these eruptions, these representations, erupt into things like the 1995 riot. So on a conceptual level, right, Miriam Khan is saying place is more than a static backdrop. It's culturally constructed, it's laden with cultural meanings, and because of that, it's also laden with political conflicts and contradictions. And to make this argument, she draws on Foucault and Lefebvre. You don't need to master their concepts, but they are kind of helpful for thinking about this article. Foucault has this idea of heterotopia, which is space that is multiple. He gives the example of a mirror, right, where you look into a mirror and you get this illusion of there being further space behind the mirror that's reflected back on you. Another example of heterotopias are museums, right? You go into a museum and you look at these exhibits and it's representing something to you. It represents, for example, a historical world, a cultural world that's actually supposed to be somewhere else other than the museum, right? If you go to a museum on shipping in the Gulf Coast, I'm actually thinking of a specific museum here, even though that seems esoteric. But right, the idea is you see these exhibits and you're in the museum building and yet you're imagining this larger space of the shipping world in the 1900s, for example. So in this way, museums are multiple spaces. It's the concrete space you're in, the physical space of the museum, as well as the kind of imagined space of the broader world that's being represented. Lefebvre talks about third space in a very similar way. Third space is not simply physical space, nor is it mental space, but it's really the way in which these interact. It's both of these and more. Third space is social space and lived space. So we can again think of Tahiti as multiple spaces along these lines of tourism, nuclear testing, and indigenous land. And these understandings of space are actually quite contradictory. But what Miriam Kahn does really nicely is when she talks about tourist representations, she situates this within the longer history of representations of places like Tahiti and how these emerge from colonial processes of exploration and appropriation. And one of the things she points out, right, is there's this long history of representing Tahiti in terms of being a space that's seductive, that is, what's the word I'm looking for? Not just seductive, but also a paradise on earth, right? In large part through these images of bare-breasted Tahitian women. And of course, as we learn, some of those images are quite curated. For example, sometimes they are French women or mixed-race women who have a luau placed on them in order to make them look Tahitian, while also fitting with mass-marketed French senses of desire that are very racialized in terms of race and gender. But of course, these images that we see that are seen around the globe of Tahiti as this paradise, as this seductive place, really are at odds with indigenous understandings of the land, right? Which is as a place that was born by gods, as a place that's an important site of reciprocal relationships, as a place that, for example, needs to be caretaken, but in return will provide food and subsistence. Or place land as a kind of a matter of genealogy and kin-based claims to land. And so she talks about early in her research thinking about these differences, these different understandings of Tahiti as a place, and thinking about them as kind of free-floating, right? These kinds of two ways of understanding Tahiti that don't really interact at all. But as she finds out, she was wrong. So I just did a Google image search for Tahiti, and this is what I found. As Miriam Kahn notes, right, there's this way in which these images are very standardized. Even though these are images that come from a vast array of websites, they're all very similar to one another. And just to give you a sense of how is Tahiti represented within these kinds of touristic economies, within these systems of mass media representations. There's always oceans, beautiful oceans. Often there's these hut things that I guess is like a resort or something. Often you'll have palm trees or forests and mountains. And often you'll have some white people running around on the beach or swimming. Then I did a Google search for Tahiti postcards, which was fun because it gave me more of a historical sense of how Tahiti has been represented. And of course, you'll see continuity. You'll see similar themes between these more contemporary-looking photographs from tourism websites compared to these postcards. I don't know if it's that people don't send postcards anymore, which is why these are old, or if there's just more vintage postcard collectors. But either way, apparently by searching Tahiti postcards, you can get a historical sense of the tourism industry here. But of course, French Polynesia is not just a vacation spot. It's also a nuclear testing facility. And the issue here, right, of course, is that even if these bombs aren't being tested on Tahiti itself, nuclear fallout travels. And so the irony as well that Miriam points out, right, is that it was actually nuclear testing and tourism that emerged together in Tahiti, right? Because both of them are dependent on things like building new airports, which could facilitate visits from government agents, as well as tourists. And so in the 1960s, you start to see this shift towards both nuclear testing and the expansion of tourism in Tahiti. And one of the issues here, right, is of course that in as former French colonies in North Africa seek independence, right, France is no longer able to use those colonized landscapes as testing facilities. Now, this really raises a tough set of questions in terms of where nuclear testing facilities are located. That raises the issue of whose lives are considered disposable and whose lives are not, right? And then how do governments engage in a kind of politics of propaganda, or again, sending out mass media representations that claim that the effects of nuclear testing are fine, that no one's really at risk. Now, subtext in the United States, where are nuclear weapons tested in the United States? The answer is again in Pacific Islands and Navajo territory. And actually, if you look at what the most significant nuclear disasters in world history, right, you see, of course, Chernobyl, Fukushima, but then the third one is the spill resulted from nuclear waste retention ponds in the Southwest, in which basically these irradiated retention ponds flooded and spread across these massive areas, right, and rendered entire huge swaths of the landscape irradiated. But the thing is, a lot of people don't really know about that history, about this event, because even though it was one of the worst nuclear disasters in world history, the US government said, it's not that bad because this place it's not very populous. There's not a lot of people living here. But most of the people living there were Navajo people. I should have said this. If you're interested in looking more into the issues that I was just talking about, the spill I was talking about is the Church Rock uranium spill, which happened on July 16th in 1979. In 1995, after the French government had issued a moratorium on nuclear testing in French Polynesia, in 1995 they decided they would resume testing. And the result was mass anti-nuclear protests across French Polynesia. And once the government resumed testing, it places like Tahiti erupted in riots, and these riots received international media attention. And you have international anti-nuclear advocates, right, who start to pressure places like France. And if you look at this image from a news article, right, Fallout in Paradise, this is such a contrast to the images we were looking at before, the tourist-based images of Tahiti, right? At the same time, we see an invocation of that system of representations, Fallout in Paradise. And so the news article itself is trying to draw attention to this disjuncture. But what's really interesting here, right, is we see this new set of mass media images that are so much in conflict with the older ones, right? And this moment, right, where these seemingly separate understandings of Tahiti as a place erupt and explode into violence. I often think of, this is a bit of a stretch, but I often think of the line from the poem A Dream Deferred, right? Sometimes it explodes. So I don't know if this is a dream being deferred, but we do have an explosion of what before was the subtext of colonial violence and colonial subordination. Now, the second article for today, the second reading, is much more straightforward, so I'm not going to spend as much time on it. But the context, right, is that in the 1980s especially, you start to see this shift in global production and economic production. And a lot of the factories that had been located in the United States get outsourced and moved to other countries. As I said earlier, right, this ends up being about moving factories to places with looser labor laws and protections, and so that companies can increase production, can increase profit by not having to pay as much money on, what's the word I'm looking for? On providing humane working conditions. And so this is really economically devastating in places like the US, right, where you see this shift from an industrial economy based on factory labor with a pretty robust working class that's often quite well unionized to a shift towards the service economy. Not to mention just as a radical loss of job opportunities. And so we can think about this as a process of globalization. Again, this really crystallizes in the 1980s, but the roots, it starts happening before that, of course, and as Philip Bourgeois notes, we can really look at this, we can see this happening as early as the 1960s. And so in this context, he's interested in Puerto Rican laborers in El Barrio in New York. And his question, right, is why do people get involved in this crack economy? And this is so important, right, because his question there is a really good question. Because as he notes, and as you might expect, right, in mainstream society, there's this common sense understanding around race and ethnicity and class that blames individual victims for their failures, that would say, these are criminals, right, and leave it at that. And Philip Bourgeois doesn't say, okay, these are criminals, and leave it at that. He says, why are people turning to an informal economy? Why does this make sense to people in their own lives? That's a good ethnographic question. And what he finds, right, is that if you're in the informal economy, you get a lot more respect. You just don't have to deal with the constant disrespect, the constant dissing that results from office labors. There's also conflicts in terms of gender expectations that come into play. And so his point, right, is that ultimately that the underground economy, and I'm quoting here, is best understood as a mode of resistance to subordination in the service sector of the U.S. economy. It's a mode of resistance to the kinds of class hierarchies and racial hierarchies and ethnic hierarchies that are embedded within service labor. And it's an alternative that offers things like greater respect. By the way, you could say greater respect. You could also say more humane working conditions. Because, even though it's probably a stretch to talk about crack dealing as humane working conditions, we're comparing this to the service industry, right? Or the office-based jobs elsewhere in New York. And Phillips Bourgeois' article really translates into, or takes us to the second core concept that I want to talk about today, which is racial capitalism. Essentially, my question is, how do we understand the historical as well as the contemporary relationship between capitalism, racism, and colonialism? How do these three processes or dynamics, how do they relate to one another? How do they bring one another into existence in a historical sense, right? How is the emergence of colonialism or capitalism or racism? How are these things interdependent on one another? And then how do they remain related to one another today, right? In a world that is not always as explicitly colonial, but sometimes it is, in the case of Tahiti or the Navajo Reservation, but in which these colonial dynamics continue to linger, or the legacies of them continue to linger. So how do we understand these things to relate to one another? And here I want to just have you guys watch this video, Geographies of Racial Capitalism with Ruth Wilson Gilmore. So I have several discussion questions for you if you want structure, but as always, if there's an issue that you have a burning desire to talk about that's not included in these discussion questions, just go for it. I'm trying to offer structure. I'm not trying to determine the shape of our conversation. And I'm always happy when students take our conversations in a different direction. The other thing is you don't have to answer all of these in your posts. But again, they're just meant to give you a little bit of structure if that's helpful.